When I was here in 2018 with Nora Palma, and I preached here, this sanctuary was under construction, so it's nice to see it. And you're putting it to good use. I'm Dory Hjalmarson. I am a PCUSA mission co-worker, and I partner with the Honduran Presbyterian Church. I'm a facilitator for theological education and leadership development in that role. And so my job is to, at the invitation of the Honduran Presbyterian Church, accompany their church leadership, especially their pastors, in theological education, in development of their church leadership structure. It's a very small denomination. It's about 28 congregations. It's a young denomination. The First Presbyterian Church was founded about 65 years ago. And it's a growing denomination. The way it has grown is to adopt congregations that spring up independently, usually in a self-proclaimed pastor's living room, and grow into a full-fledged church, and then want more of a connectional, supportive experience with a larger denomination. And so sometimes they find the Presbyterian Church and we adopt them in. Pastor Juan, who's the moderator of the presbytery there, and one of my mentors, he's a very skilled, wise pastor, says that Presbyterians go where no one else will go. So that's what he tells all of us when we complain that we're going to these churches in far-flung mountaintops and miles and hours from anywhere and with no cell phone service and requires a four-wheel drive to get there. Presbyterians will go where no one else will. I just want to share with you, I think most of you heard my message this morning and got an idea of some of the things I do, but I wanted to share a couple of stories that I think are good examples of my first 4 years in Honduras. When I first met you all, I think I'd been there just a few months, and now I'm 4 years in, and I've re-upped for another 4 years. And now I can tell people I have a BC life and an after COVID life. BC is now before COVID, it's not before Christ. So in my BC life, I did a lot of teaching. I worked with 2 other Honduran facilitators to teach a curriculum that was developed by the Latin American Biblical University in Costa Rica. And it's a curriculum that is very accessible to pastors or to church leaders who have no formal education. The majority, actually, I think all of our church pastors have a high school education or less, if you can believe that. It's a very different accessibility level of education and very different methods than we're familiar with as Presbyterians here. Pastors are rigorously educated and have to learn lots of languages and be examined in those languages, and it's very difficult to become a Presbyterian pastor in the States. And it is also difficult in Honduras, but because there's no seminary, and there's very little access to education, especially if you're in a rural area. And so pastors have skills and are good pastors, but they're also hungry for better preparation and better ways to serve their congregations. So I work with 2 young women, we're about the same age, they're not that young, who are university educated, and we facilitate this program that's accessible to all levels of educated people. Even people who are semi-literate can get something out of this education. And so I was kind of nervous when I first moved to Honduras. It's a very different culture. There are very different value systems. I'm a lefty hippie feminist. Honduras is a rather conservative culture generally, and Christians also are very conservative. They do ordain women as pastors in the Presbyterian Church, but not all Not all denominations do, and there are very few female pastors. And I'm the first single female pastor they've had working with them. Their last mission coworker was a couple, a male pastor and his wife. And so I was breaking some molds and some expectations for what a normal mission coworker would be. The first task they set to me was the weekend of my installation as their mission coworker, and it was to run a workshop on the Reformed understanding of the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion. And it was the weekend of a presbytery plenary meeting, so all the pastors of the denomination were there, and all the theological education students were there, and everyone showed up to hear what this new missionary was going to say and what she was going to be like, and it was kind of a test, I think. So I knew that one difference between the Presbyterian Church of Honduras and the Presbyterian Church in the United States is that the Hondurans don't baptize babies. They believe in a believer's baptism. As an adult, you confess your faith in Jesus Christ and are baptized, which is fine. There are biblical arguments on both sides of that issue. It's not a live or die issue, but I, as the granddaughter of a Presbyterian pastor, was baptized as a baby by that grandfather, and so I was confirmed in the United Methodist Church and remembered my baptism, even though I didn't remember my baptism in that ceremony. And then I joined a Presbyterian church as an adult and remembered my baptism again. And then I was ordained as a deacon and I remembered my baptism again. And then I was ordained as a pastor and I remembered my baptism then, even with a few other instances scattered in between. So I feel sufficiently baptized. I don't feel that I need to be re-baptized to make it valid. But that's not what the Presbyterians in Honduras necessarily believe. So I told them my baptism story in this workshop with all these pastors meeting me for the first time. And I asked them, so knowing what you know about my baptism, can I, in a few hours when I'm installed as your mission co-worker, now that I've moved here and my parents are here and everything, can I be a fully participating member in your church? Can I receive communion? Can I serve communion? Can I baptize other people? Can I marry and bury people? Can I be a fully participating member? Can I teach your other pastors? And about half the room had really skeptical looks on their faces. They were not sure that they could honestly answer yes. But we started a discussion. Of course, I didn't necessarily want an answer. We wanted the discussion, and we wanted to be able to defend our own arguments without just believing what had been told to us before. And so we went back and forth, and I had given them citations from John Calvin and from various theologians and from the Bible and from church doctrinal statements, and there literally are arguments on both sides that are valid and from trusted sources. And so I was not trying to preach or change anyone's mind, but we went round and round and round and round, and suddenly one gentleman stood up, and I didn't know him at the time, but it turns out he was is a 65-year-old farmer. He lives in the most remote village of the whole denomination, on the top of a mountain, farms coffee and subsistence crops. He was a theological education student, so he was one of our students and a ruling elder in his congregation. And he is semi-literate, and he'd never been, before our theological education program, had never been to a formal day of school in his life, not even elementary school. And he stood up and he said, "I'm Brother Ronaldo, I'm from this village, I'm a ruling elder from what I read here, and he pointed to a few different of the citations that we had given, from what I'm reading here, baptism is something that happens in your heart. It's a change that God makes in your heart. And if Hermana Dori, if Sister Dori says she's baptized in her heart, well, we have to trust that. We have to trust what she says. There's no other test to know whether someone's baptized for real or not. And so I said, class dismissed. But all of my anxiety and worry that I would be able to be accepted into this more conservative, very different culture of church and theology, and also that I would be able to accept serving people who believe things that are very different from how I believe, and be able to love them and be able to serve them, all of those anxieties melted away because someone else had stood up and said, I'm opening the door to loving you and accepting you and trusting you. And so I was able to accept and love and trust back. And so that was the beginning of my, what has become a 4-year ministry in Honduras. Reynaldo graduated from the program, and he is still serving as a ruling elder of his congregation. And he's, you don't have favorites, but he's my favorite student of all of them. So another story that actually happened coincided with one of your church's visits to Honduras. One of my tasks also was to go with presbytery leaders to help train and build up congregational leadership, to train session members, to train new deacons, to train church treasurers and church secretaries. And the presbytery had set a program in the first year that I was in Honduras to visit churches and educate clusters of church officers. And so I accompanied them in that. And was that Jihan? Hello, it's good to see you. We went to this remote, very conservative, traditional village, town, an agricultural town, where women are expected to wear skirts to church, and not only to church, but really in their daily life. Christian women should wear skirts and cover their heads in church and sit separately from the men in the church, so they sit separately. A very kind of old school, very traditional way of doing church. I knew this going in, but we weren't having church. We were having a class, so I thought it was okay to wear slacks to class and to teach my class. I did not know yet that wherever 2 or 3 Presbyterian pastors are gathered, a church service will break out in Honduras. And so, at the end of the day of classes, when we had trained the deacons and elders, Pastor Juan, who's the moderator of the presbytery and a church pastor himself, and a very wise and loving, caring mentor to me, said, Hermana Dori, Sister Dori, I would love it if you would ordain the deacons that we have just trained. And I'll ordain the elders. We're going to have a church service, and it will be a beautiful celebration, and you will be a blessing to our congregation. I said, thank you so much. I'm honored. I accept. Yes, I will do that with you. Thank you for asking me. And he looked me up and down, and he said, but Hermana Dori, you don't have a skirt to change into, do you? And I said, I do not. But that's okay, Hermano Juan. You don't have a skirt either. And so Hermano Juan just stared at me, dumbfounded, and I stared at him, wondering if I was going to be fired, and he burst out laughing. And he said what has become sort of a daily refrain, ay, 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 hermana Dori. And he let me go ahead and ordain the deacons that day. And I caught him weeks later telling the story to everyone that he saw. You would not believe what hermana Dori said to me the other day. And everybody would laugh. And his wife winked at me. She thought it was great. So a few weeks later, your church, Phil and his group, was visiting, and we went to that same location, and I was driving a four-wheel drive truck and driving people to this location. And even though I was driving this four-wheel drive truck, I made sure and had my skirt on and my nice shoes, and I was ready for church. And as I got out of the truck, in my skirt, the women of the church, some of whom I'd just ordained a few weeks earlier as deacons, came running out of the church and gave me a big hug and welcomed me. My mom happened to be with us that time, and they were so happy to meet my mother. And they said, Dori, you look so pretty in your skirt. So I've never been back to that location without a skirt, at least in my backpack. So, but again, this is an example of the kind of acceptance and the acceptance and humility. So when I am able to demonstrate humility and set aside any smart ideas or authority or power that I think I have or answers that I think I have in any given situation, when I'm able to set that aside and sit alongside the people I'm trying to accompany and be with, we're able to form deeper and stronger relationships, which always provides a better answer and better idea and better, fuller Christ-like relationship than anything that I could come up with on my own. Another time my parents were visiting, they went to that same Morapokai village, and I was having a meeting in another town with my education facilitators, and my parents went along with Juan to this village, and they were doing some light construction work, and my dad was spending time with Juan. He speaks Spanish. And Juan, my dad related to me later, Juan told my dad, oh, we love Hermana Dori. We love her. She eats everything. It's not really the compliment that you want to hear when you're a pastor who's preaching and teaching. It's nice that they said that, but I think it means that I do approach all situations, I try to approach all situations that I encounter with humility and try everything that's put in front of me and not turn up my nose at any homemade chicken soup with the chicken that was just killed that morning from the backyard and corn off the cob that was just harvested that morning. So approaching the people that I serve with humility and gratitude has gone a long way to make these 4 years wonderful. Over the past 2 years, of course, things have been very different. We had COVID lockdowns, and I stayed in Honduras for 18 months straight, locked in my house, not seeing hardly anybody. And the church has started to go through a transformation. And I started talking about that in the sermon this morning. If you didn't hear it, I'll recap a little bit. The church, the Presbyterian Church, in the past has depended, its mission efforts have largely depended on U.S. short-term groups coming to do some sort of project. So the church has a program to build urban homes for needy people that they find or that are members of their church. And so one presbytery in Pennsylvania participates in that program and comes twice a year to help build homes and fund those homes. Another presbytery in Tampa has a program where they mount medical clinics. They have medical people that are able to do that, and they come twice a year to visit rural areas of the church and host medical clinics in those churches and provide care for people. And there are various other projects. You all have been involved in construction projects and work at Via de Gracia, which is a retreat center, various different things. But when COVID hit, we've had now 2 years when no U.S. partners have come to visit. And so the church has had to rethink its dependence on U.S. volunteers to guide and direct their mission efforts. They know that they are called to serve their communities, but they've had to figure out how to do that on their own and how to assess community needs, how to connect and relate to communities without the North American presence that they've had before. They've packaged thousands of bags of food since the beginning of COVID, not just after the hurricanes that hit in November of 2020, to help churches and to help the larger communities where their churches exist. And in the latter half of last year, a group of volunteers, including Jiham's parents, helped start and are starting a mission arm of the Presbyterian Church of Honduras whose goal will not necessarily be to be directed by or dependent on U.S. group participation. We want to know what we're called to do in our communities year-round, not only when U.S. volunteers are present. And so that's a very exciting transformation. I'm not really big on silver lining talk, but it's something that this time of COVID and isolation and being at least in person cut off from the presence of U.S. volunteers that has sort of forced a transformation that has been long needed, and I hope will continue, and that I hope U.S. churches can learn from. I think U.S. congregations who are especially congregations that may have more money and have a mindset that they want to provide help and to provide aid and to help those people may start to look at Honduras as a people that they can rather learn from. And my dream is that more U.S. congregations will be able to reflect on not only what they can do and how they can serve, but what they need and what they can receive from relationships with churches like Honduras that have traditionally been on the kind of needy side of the equation of mission and aid. So to that end, I want to invite you all to participate in a study that we will have during Lent. So the Presbytery of Arkansas is hosting this study, a weekly study, 6 weeks, that is translated by me. It's written by the University in Costa Rica, and it's part of the curriculum, the theological education curriculum that we've used to help the church in Honduras reflect on their sense of mission and what God is calling them to do. And it's now translated into English, and we'll be using that via Zoom with the Presbytery of Arkansas and anyone else who seeks to join. So join us in the transformation. So that's all I have. We've got pictures showing of all of the of some of the things that we've done, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Yes. In where? Yes. There's a very strong federal government, and most of the cities have some connection to the city government that's near them, yes. There's usually a mayor, there's usually some sort of town council, and there are state governments, and there's a national government. Well, it depends. So we have 28 congregations. Some of the congregations are in coffee growing zones, and they are coffee growing communities. So we're right in the middle of the coffee growing zones. And some of those are about 6 of our congregations are in areas like that. And we have several congregations where most of their commercial work is in fishing. We have several that are mainly like subsistence farmers. They're not really growing commercial crops, but they're growing their yearly supply of food. And then we have 3 congregations in a large city, Tegucigalpa, which is where I live. So that's a big urban center with all the diversity of what people do. There's several factory workers. There's a lot of textiles that are produced in Honduras. A lot of your t-shirts will say made in Honduras. Yes, sir. All together or separately or differently? Yeah, and I can speak to that within the Presbyterian Church. There is a very strong consortium of women, a Presbyterian women's group within the Presbyterian Church, and also a youth partnership. There's actually a youth group that has expanded to include several different congregations in Honduras that partners with a youth group in Pennsylvania, and they have a long-running mutual visit program, and they exchange friendship and service projects together. The majority of the church's attendance and membership is female, mostly women, mostly mothers. And the majority of the church leadership is male. There are some female pastors. We do ordain women. I think there are 3 ordained female pastors and 3 lay pastors who are serving congregations. There are rather strict expectations around gender roles and how a family should be. So most women are very dedicated to their families. That's their first priority, raising children and making sure their children are safe and fed and housed, and the church supports them in that and tries to support them in that, to greater or lesser success at some points. Yeah, in the church there is a growing youth group movement or youth group activity. I don't know if I would call it a movement, but I think the new kind of transformation that's happening around serving the community, I think is sprouting up from younger people. So many of these younger people have been actually educated by is rallying around. Did that answer your question, I hope? Yeah, okay.
What draws the residents of, especially the smaller families, to the church?
It's a very mixed answer. I think the answer to that will be as diverse as the individuals who come to the church. I think Honduras is there's a lot of need and a lot of desire. There's a longing for healthy, whole community. The government institutions there's a very low trust threshold for government institutions. It's very corrupt, very difficult political environment, and society in many ways is collapsed and broken down. And many times the church can be seen as a kind of a beacon in that darkness, a light in that darkness. And so if churches are healthy and well-run and preaching messages of hope and wholeness and love, I think that's what draws a lot of people to churches. Not just in rural environments, in urban environments too. The cities are very difficult places to live. The cities are full of internal migrants who have come from the rural areas for jobs, and that's a very difficult thing. Hondurans are very family-oriented. It's very difficult for Hondurans to be away from their family. There are many multi-generational homes where it's just sort of unthinkable to leave your home before you're married. And even after you're married, you'd stay in the home with your spouse and live with your parents or one of the sets of parents. And so when people are kind of forced to migrate, either to cities or outside the country, what becomes their family? Often it's the church. In the best of circumstances of the church, there are not any other great options. There's, street gangs. That's not a great option either. Yes, there is. Honduras is a way station for drug trafficking from South America to the U.S., and there's a strong narco-trafficking culture. There isn't a lot of drug use. There's more nowadays, but drugs are a commodity, so you're meant to sell it, you're not meant to use it. So there is in that sense, there's a drug culture. Something like 85% of the cocaine that comes from South America stops in Honduras. Yes. Yeah, there are other denominations. There's a large Catholic denomination, and there are several other, it's probably about 50-50 Catholic and Protestant. There is very little cooperation between churches. There's a lot of suspicion and kind of competition for believers, which is sad for me. I grew up in Southwest U.S., surrounded by Mormons and Catholics and Protestants and people of diverse cultures, and I value that. It's a personal value of mine to work with diverse people, diverse beliefs, and that's not really part of the culture. And politics plays a role in that too. There are several associations of churches that really end up serving as seeking to influence or seeking to rub elbows with powerful politicians and align themselves with political issues. And so then any churches who don't wish to do that then kind of are suspicious of those efforts to associate with other denominations. So we're going to make an effort in the theological education program. We're going to run out of Presbyterians to educate soon, so we hope to make it a more ecumenical, and the program is not specifically Presbyterian. It could be open to other denominations, so we hope to try in our programs celebrate that a little bit and invite others in, but it will be a tough sell. So, yes, Phil.
What have you learned about
Yeah, in the time that I've been there, just 4 years, most of the migrants waiting in Mexico are Honduran. I don't know any family who doesn't have a person in the United States or who hasn't attempted to go to the United States or to Spain. The US and Spain are the two destinations most common. Literally, I don't know any single family who has not been affected by migration, or the separation of their family by forced migration. So it's just part of the fabric of life in Honduras. You'll remember a few years ago when the caravans were all in the news. They were all leaving from Honduras, and I couldn't go in any public space without hearing conversations about people making decisions to leave on a caravan, talking about the next caravan that's going, criticizing mothers for taking their children on that dangerous journey, criticizing mothers for leaving their children behind on that dangerous journey, talking about the breakdown of families and the difficulty of grandparents raising children while parents leave. It's pervasive and omnipresent. Yeah. Coming back to Honduras? They're coming back being deported usually from Mexico or from the US. There's a huge recidivism rate. I mean, people land and then turn around and head straight back north. They're not making it into the United States yet. The border is still closed to most attempts. Most are seeking asylum, and so they'll come into the US and be processed in an asylum process, and most won't be granted asylum. But no, the unemployment is enormous. There are very few jobs that are livable. And it's even harder to farm. The cycle of drought and storms is becoming more and more severe. Places that used to have 2 harvests per year now only have 1, and so it's harder to make ends meet. And unemployment is very, very high. Around 30% of the economy is remittances from outside the country. So family members sending money back. So it's not produced inside the country, it's produced outside the country. Almost a third of the wealth in Honduras comes from outside the country. And those are just individual remittances, like families sending, $200 a month back home. It's a third of the economy.
You talked about the Seminole project in the sermon. Can you give us a progress update? This congregation, I don't know if you all know this, we've given $4,000 recently, which is being held up in the bank right now. And eventually, we're trying to fund the furtherance of that project. So we're just be interested in how well it's going. Do you feel like it's effective and it's meeting needs, and what needs are being met?
Yeah, so these young people, these young volunteers after the hurricane, met the emergent needs post-hurricane, and then we're hearing stories about crops that were lost and long-term effects of natural disasters and other kinds of needs that were like medium and long-term needs in those communities. And so they have formed this organization. They're still formalizing it. It's called Buen Sembrador, the good sower, which comes straight from that parable that we studied all year and reflected on, and formulated it to serve communities that were in need, and demonstrated some sort of ability to think outside the box to solve problems that the community identifies. And then the Buen Sembrador program will help plant those seeds, whether they're literal seeds or figurative seeds, to provide capital or training or other resources that we can find in those communities. So we tried it with 2 pilot projects in 2 of the communities where we were serving in the post-hurricane era. So we provided, at the community's request, fertilizer and some pesticides and different things that they needed to replant harvests that they had lost in the hurricane, and then using the profits or the excess that they would have harvested to benefit their community somehow. And so that could be giving that seed capital to the next 10 recipients in their community that they identify, or it could be using it in some other way to benefit their community. So it's not like a loan they're returning to us, but they're kind of paying it forward in a certain way. So that's the idea, and they've written a proposal to the Presbytery of Honduras, and the Presbytery has yet to, their January meeting got canceled by Omicron variant, and so they haven't met on that proposal yet, but they will, and it's my hope that they'll accept it and set them on their path. The next activity of that group, I hope, will be a disaster response training and a kind of a resilience training, volunteer resilience training, offered through ACT Alliance, which Presbyterian Disaster Agency is a member of. And so we think that we'll be able to gather some Honduran volunteers and members of that group to go through that training and better their skills to respond to the next emerging need. Heifer Project? I don't really. Our previous PCUSA mission coworker couple, Tim and Gloria Wheeler, worked with Heifer Project in an area where we don't have any Presbyterian churches, but there are many Presbyterian volunteers because of Tim and Gloria who've been to that region. But Heifer does not currently have a PCUSA partner in Honduras. My understanding is that they're operating more and more as like a microfinance entity in Honduras. So I just don't have much interaction with them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be. Rural adolescents have very little access to school, so even if they don't go to the big city, they will have to go to some other town or some larger town to get a high school education. And education is only required through 6th grade, I think. So it's only offered through 6th grade in most places. And to get beyond 6th grade, you need to make a big effort to do that and plan to do that. And so if you're not involved in agriculture or some sort of agricultural effort, like your parents usually are in a rural setting, you're going to be moving to a larger town or to the big city. And so there's a big, brain and talent drain kind of effect that we're familiar with here in rural areas as well. And then in the big cities, jobs are more prevalent which isn't saying much. I mean, there are no jobs in the rural areas, and there are some more jobs in the cities. There's also a big risk of violence and gang activity, so youth will be kind of running the risk of being recruited by gangs and by, street delinquency activities. And so I think the church is one avenue for a youth to become involved in a community that is a different option. It's a different path than choosing a kind of gang life. And then many youth miss their parents. Many youth are growing up with either one parent or both parents absent because of migration, because they've moved either to another city or to another country to work and send money home. So their relationship with their parents is on video call, and they're being raised by their grandparents or an aunt or some other family member. So that's a real strain on a lot of youth. I talked to a youth group retreat once and briefly mentioned migration. And several different youth came up to me afterwards and were talking about, their parents being absent. They miss their father, they miss their mother, and it really affects youth in and out of the church, both. So, yeah. So yes, there are Presbyterian churches there's two Reformed denominations in Honduras. There's a Christian Reformed Church of Honduras, and the Presbyterian Church of Honduras. And there are Presbyterian denominations who also partner with the PCUSA in Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica. Not sure about Panama, but yes, most churches, most countries have a Presbyterian presence. We're not a global denomination, so they don't, the PCUSA doesn't govern any of those churches. They are self-governed. The Presbyterian Church of Honduras was actually founded by lay Presbyterians from Guatemala who came to Honduras for work 65 years ago, and in the community where they landed found no Presbyterian church, so they formed one, and that's how it started. So there is some, historic relationship with the Guatemalan Presbyterian Church, but it's independent of it. It's not governed in any way by the Guatemalan Presbyterian Church. Yep. I'm not at all. No, I've never heard of it. It's interesting, though.
I know it was active 5 years ago. I don't know what it is right now. It's very active.
Yeah, interesting. There's a lot of coffee grown in Honduras. It's very chic.
See if I can get information for you.
Thanks. I think Ted had a question, or Leslie had a question.
I guess it's about 5 years ago we were in Honduras having to do with setting up water filtration places, and I was curious if those are still active, the solar and the sun and living waters, and I thought that was just a great partnership we were able to provide Honduras communities.
Yes.
And I wondered if those are still going on. Can you say something about that?
They are, yes. So this church in Presbytery of Arkansas has been very active in Solar Under the Sun and Living Waters for the World, which are Presbyterian missions from the related to the PCUSA. And the El Horno project, which was a joint, they wanted to install water purification in this rural Presbyterian community, but they also did not have electricity, so they made a joint effort with Solar Under the Sun and Living Waters to install first solar panels to operate the water filtration system, and then the water filtration system, which is a micro business that's run at the church, so sells water at an affordable cost, drinking water at an affordable cost in bottled water, and it is running strong, and they are still installing solar panels. Several Solar Under the Sun installation projects were canceled, once prior to COVID and once post-COVID, and so we got tired of waiting, and they started sending the equipment down, and there are several all Honduran teams that have been continuing to install. I think they've got 15 or 16 houses left to go in that initial installation phase.
If you all are interested in either one of those, it's very easy. It's Presbyterian. You can always volunteer. I have Solar Under the Sun or Living Waters for the World.
Yeah, Living Waters for the World has in-country staff, and so they're all over the country. They don't install just in Presbyterian churches. They install in all kinds of places across the country. But several have been installed and are still working in at least 3 Presbyterian churches, I think, still have living water systems, and including El Horno, where they had that joint solar water project.
So we're getting at 5:30, and we would like to take a trip again to Honduras as soon as it's safe with COVID. So you think about that and keep you posted. If you're here, I know you're interested. And we'd love to have a group that would go down. There's 2 ways you can go, and often we've kind of done a hybrid model. Some people really want to go and help and serve and make a difference. And other people would really like to go and learn and just kind of have connections and fellowship and solidarity with Honduran Presbyterians. I think the best trips are probably
Which also makes a difference.
so, and we try to plan it so we'll do it a little bit of both. But we'll keep you posted as soon as it's safe, we'll do that, and hopefully we'll give you enough to make sure that you make time. It's time for us to move over to the fellowship hall. We've got a nice Honduran dinner, and there's plenty of food, so everybody come, and we can eat a hearty meal. It's a Honduran dinner, it'll be great. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you.